So we had a community session in March and we got a lot of feedback and it was awesome. And we're really grateful for all that feedback. We've been talking about it and we're continuing to think about how we can incorporate some of those ideas. And so we've been kind of working on what is Long Talks in the Woods. And we can't be everything, but we can be some things. And we hope that we can be helping people to move towards actions they want to take and towards using skills and passions for the benefit of life on Earth. So Long Talks in the Woods is a speaker and discussion series. Long Talks in the Woods aims to be a generative hive, a place for learning, a place for inskillment, a place where people can come to understand current issues in new ways and consider how they would like to engage. It is a capacity building space for change makers. So that's where we're at, April 17th, with Long Talks in the Woods. And I'm going to pass it over in a second. We have developed, we've started including some guidelines for respectful communication. And I'll just say that so I make sure we've all heard it. And I trust folks here to be doing these things, but I'm just going to read it. So 1, please share your knowledge, experiences, concerns, and opinions with care. 2, please listen without tuning out those with whom you disagree. And please listen for the best intentions in what others say. Speak truthfully, briefly, and on topic. Before you speak, ask yourself if you are speaking out of defensiveness or out of a desire to seek approval or absolve guilt. If so, please resist the urge to speak and instead take a moment to listen to others and check in with your feelings. Where are they coming from? Do speak up to protect the existence, frustrations, and justified rage of those who are marginalized. Regarding interruptions, in general, we need to allow people to speak until they are finished speaking. I may interject if we need to be back on topic or need to make space for others to speak. And interruptions by anyone are appropriate when we perceive aggressions or microaggressions or dismissal. And so lastly, we assume the best of those who have gathered here. It is now time for me to pass it to Sean, who will introduce us to our speaker.
Hi, I am Sean Sellers. I'm very excited to introduce Jen Gobby, who is a colleague of mine and someone I learn from and with a lot. She is an activist scholar, a course lecturer at McGill, and a postdoctoral fellow at Concordia. She did her PhD through the Economics of the Anthropocene Partnership at McGill, and her work focuses on understanding and supporting processes of transformative change towards environmental and climate justice. So just what we are interested in. She's the author of the book and the report More Powerful Together, which are listed on the session site so that you can link to those, and is the co-author of a recent report called Decolonizing Climate Policy in Canada, which is also linked through the page. She's the founder of Mud Girls Natural Building Collective and lives in the forest in rural Quebec, where she and her partner are experimenting with permaculture and learning from the land. And haven't covered everything, but I am excited to hear her talk about theories of change today, because this is a big part of where I learn from her, and I'm excited for us to all share in that. And if there's anything that you want to share about yourself that I missed that should be there, please go on. But in the meantime, here is Jen Gobby.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Barb. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, especially on the subject of theories of change. It's my favorite thing to talk about. I really, I think about this stuff all the time. I give talks and teach on different subjects, but this is by far my favorite thing to talk about. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Is that okay? Yeah. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So you might need to make me encompasses so much, it's hard to know what we're talking about. So we're going to try to narrow it down. What is it we're talking about? And we're going to share this quote that Sean actually included on the website for this talk. And it's from Eve Tuck and Yang from the book Youth Resistance Research and Theories of Change. And it says, how does change really happen? These are pedagogical questions, meaning they are meant to be asked in community in conversation with lived life. The answers are important, yes, but more important is the opportunity to think and feel through these questions collectively. So I think this is an amazing quote for this event, because I see you folks in your community and the long talks being specifically this work of collectively thinking and feeling through the big questions around change and around tackling the crisis of our time. So it's an honor to be here and to be thinking collectively with you about theories of change. So I just wanted to start with a little bit asking you folks to share some things with me, because I'm not sure, I don't know where, I'm not part of this community or this conversation, so I'd love to know a bit of where you're at. Like what is your community or each of you individually seeking to change, either in your community, your province, the country, the world, your lives? And what do you think is required to make that change happen? What do you think it's gonna take? These are two things that I think any theory of change conversation to start with. Does anyone feel comfortable in sharing either of these things with the group at the moment? What do you want to change?
I can say something if I, in my own work, am trying to change, not myself alone, but be part of changing the way the global economy works to decarbonize and bring a bit more justice within relations. And on the smaller level, you know, we're trying to get a bylaw enacted to, you know, manage exotic animal ownership and things like that. So like lots of different like forms of change that I'm involved in right now.
Thanks, Sean. And can I just ask you, Sean, for the global economy thing, can you give a couple of, you know, in 30 words or less, what you think it's going to take?
Oh, okay. I mean, in my personal life, that is why I am doing a PhD, partially to learn how to do that, and also and like where the leverage points are for policy and institutions and people, and also to hopefully produce something that is a worthwhile tool to use to engage with those leverage points. Not very specific, but
No,
I can talk more about it later.
You have a big one. I mean, the bigger the thing you want to change, the less easy it is to answer the second question in 30 words or less. But thank you for sharing. Does anyone else want to share what they are seeking to change? Yeah, Marilyn.
Well, no, I'm going to facilitate a little bit. I see Sheila's hand up. I'm going to come to you, Sheila, but I also before that saw Krista's chat. So I'm going to read the chat to you. She said, I'd like to work towards undoing settler states, starting with how we untangle ourselves from our dependency on them. So I don't know if Krista, you want to unmute yourself and say more about that?
Sure. So that's why I was muted. For me, you know, as an Indigenous woman, I see really clearly how colonization impacts like my life and other people's lives. And you know, it was something that like most people in the world had happened to them versus a choice. So I think it's clear that there's other ways to live. And but I think we have to figure out how to stop the hardest part, I think, of people grasping the idea of uncolonizing and undoing settler states is you know, we're so dependent on them and we can't imagine how we will survive without them.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Kristen. That's I think at the heart of the many things we're trying to change, from like bylaws to economies, to trade, to different things. I mean, I think underlying all those things is is a colonial capitalist system that is driving a lot of these crises that we're trying to address. So thank you for like bringing us right to the heart of the issues. Thank you.
I'm kind of, I'm just adjusting to having everyone in a different view and trying to help facilitate, but I'm seeing that Anne and Sheila both have hands up. So I'll go to Anne first.
Sure. I am passionate about democracy in sort of like the broadest sense of the word. And what I've learned so much in the past year, looking at Krista in particular from an earlier conversation, is needing to imagine more widely than I had previously sort of limited myself to. So I've been doing a lot of research and learning from people and cultures who already have so much of this figured out. Why should we just reinvent the word real in our, narrow settler culture, right? And also just like reimagining democracy at its best, as opposed to looking at how it is right now and how it isn't meeting the needs of people and how frustrating that is. Because if you try to make something broken work, sometimes you're better just throwing the thing out and starting again. And I guess what I just really want it to do is for our democratic systems, whatever they are, to really reflect the values of justice and collectivity and interdependence and all of the good things of humanity, as opposed to narrowly limiting us to boxes that are bringing out the worst. So in terms of what that means in practical terms, I'm involved with a lot of activists working on different ideas about, electoral reform and change, but on a deeper level, a lot of self-education, reflection, basically reimagining everything in my spare time. So that's my thing.
Wonderful.
Sheila.
Thank you. Probably what I have to say is not super different from what's been said. There's maybe some method differences. But basically, the transformation of the global capitalist economy, which includes settler colonial relations necessarily, I think we need multiple types of efforts at multiple scales. But mass organizing, I think, is absolutely critical to it. And I basically, I have my video turned off today because I'm, the look on my face isn't very, very encouraging to anybody after what we've seen the Doug Ford government put in place yesterday, just sending people to their deaths, mainly low-wage racialized people to their deaths. They're crashing our healthcare system so the business can keep making money and ramping up the police-focused state powers. And so this is what we're facing, and we're not having an effective mass response to it. So I think it's what's needed, and I'm just wondering how we can make that possible. Thank you.
Okay, I can't see the hand, so let me know. Is there any other hands, or shall we move on?
That's all for now.
Okay, great. So thank you everyone for sharing. That's really helpful to hear what you're aiming to change. And it sounds like there's a lot of different sort of intervention points around the way decisions are made, the way economy functions, the way the basic structure of relations in society is, and the way current governments are responding to the current crises. So that's a lot of fodder to get going with our conversation on theories of change. I just want to make a couple of points about why I think it's so important to talk explicitly about how we think change happens. One of the reasons is because, as the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, made clear in 2018, preventing climate catastrophe will require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. So we're up against an unprecedented need for transformative change. And the fact that it's unprecedented, by definition, means we've never done it before. We don't necessarily know how to do it. Therefore, we need to be thinking hard and collectively about how we do this, how we change everything in society, how we do it in a way that's building not only a ecologically viable, but a socially just society or societies. So that's one reason we need to think about these things, because we're up against the hugest challenge in terms of forging intentional change in everything. Another reason we need to think about it is because there are tons of debates that happen within activist circles, within communities, within academic circles around how change happens. And often these debates, underlying debates about what we should do, is different assumptions about how the world works, different assumptions about how change happens. So I like to use this this little comic that came out a couple of years, I guess in 2019, when the youth climate strikes were really ramping up. And in this, you see a bunch of youth marching, and this old dude saying, no, 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 making a real difference this way, pointing to people towards the voting polls or tables. So what we see here is like the youth saying, we need to get to the streets, we need to, show the decision makers that we really care, blah, blah, blah. So there's, and the other guy saying, no, you need to go vote. So there's a lot of these debates happen about like, no, the effective thing is to, is direct action. No, the thing we need to do is focus on electoral politics. No, the thing we need to do is create the solutions and live them now. And a lot of these debates take up a lot of our time. Am I right? So, and they take up a lot of time in our movements, in our communities, but they also can fracture our collective ability to work together, because we have these different assumptions. But when you dig through your theories of change and uncover your assumptions, like, why do I think taking the streets is the way to go? Why do I think the going to vote is going to work, is the most effective thing? Why do I think that? And you could start to interrogate those assumptions and be explicit about them. And when you can interrogate them and be explicit about them, we start to transcend some of the old debates that have been fracturing lefty communities for a long time. Here in my PhD work, I talked to a lot of people about how they think change happens. And through that, I started to see several axes by which these debates tend to pivot. So one, of course, is, does change happen primarily through confrontation? Do you know what I mean? Like through conflictual means with the powers that be? Or does the change that we need, is it going to come through compromise by working together across difference with governments? So this is a major axis by which these debates play out in the world. Similarly, does change need to happen from inside the systems, by becoming decision makers, by lobbying, or by accessing the levers of power so that we can change things? Or does it need to happen from outside the system, in communities doing things for themselves, or by organizing outside formal democratic systems to push systems towards justice and sustainability? Similarly, does change come from the top down through policy, through regulation, through legislation, or does it come from the bottom up through grassroots organizing and resistance? Does the change we need, is it radical change where everything is transformed from the core? Or is it change that we need more reformist, where like small incremental changes that lead us to where we need to go? This is a huge one. These are huge debates going on all the time about these things. And then should we focus on resistance, for stopping the things we don't want, stopping pipelines, stopping unjust laws, etc.? Or should we be focusing our efforts on building the world we want? Building the community infrastructure that's going to get us through climate change, that's going to reduce emissions. And another big one is, does change come through collective organizing, most primarily, or through individual lifestyle changes? A lot of debates happen around that one. Do these resonate? Do these sound familiar? So I argue a lot in my work that if we could think more explicitly about our theories of change, we can transcend again, or at least make progress on some of these debates, and maybe find room whereby all these things are important, if insufficient on their own, and figure ways to not fracture our movements and not endlessly debate over these things, and move forward together. So one thing I really came to understand in my activism and in my research, that our understandings of change often remain in the shady realm of unstated assumptions, rather than being pulled out into the light of day for rigorous debate, scrutiny, and reflection. And so when they remain in the realm of unspoken assumptions, they can render our strategies for change less effective. And yes, like I say, they can create tensions between different agents of change who hold conflicting yet unspoken ideas. So when we speak our ideas, actually, I think change comes through collective organizing, for, you know, whatever it is. When you start to really unpack your assumptions, then we can actually have more generative conversations. And I know you folks are interested in generative conversations. So yeah, so I'm going to start to talk about what theories of change, what the phrase theories of change can mean. Here's another comic. So in a general sense, a theory of change is our best thinking about how we're going to make change in the world and why we think that's going to work. So this little comic here is like these two scientists going through this complex equation, and at some point some miracle occurs and that's going to happen. And so the work of theories of change is being more explicit there about that, and then a miracle occurs. What's actually going to happen that's going to take you from the problem and you're the thing you want to do to make it better to the actual change you want to see in the world. So how is what you're going to do going to be successful and why? So there tends to be certain elements of a theory of change that need to be specified if you're going to really think through them. The one thing, as I asked you earlier, is like, what is the thing you're trying to change? What is the system or the structure or the policy or the community or whatever it is? What are you trying to change? You need to be really explicit, because that much hinges on that. Because if you're trying to change one law, try to stop one pipeline, or trying to change the global economy, that's going to imply very different things from what needs to happen and who needs to take action. And also being explicit about what's your end goal. So Sean explained that she once said change the economic system of trade. But what is the end goal? What is the trade system or economic system you want to see? That's really important to name. And then, of course, what do you plan to do to achieve that? What's your strategy, your action, your intervention? Who do you think needs to enact this? Is it just you? Is it your community? Or does what you want to happen is going to require, you know, masses of Canadians to stand up? Or you need to be explicit about that. And then the assumption piece is, why is it going to be effective? And that's where it gets interesting, and that's where you can really start to self-critically assess your assumptions. So I'm going to tell you about, so theories of change that phrase is becoming a bit of a buzzword or buzz phrase, but it can actually refer to many different things. It could mean, it could refer to your rationale for why a specific campaign or project is going to work. So example, if we tax meat consumption in Canada, then we can more effectively encourage plant-based diets and thus reduce emissions, because increasing the cost of the product discourages people from buying it. So that there is a theory of change phrase that is explicit about the because, which is the assumption. And then you could actually say, oh, actually does increasing the cost of a product encourage people to buy it? Is that always the case? Is there cases where that doesn't happen? How has that played out in the past with other products? And you can by naming that assumption, you can really, interrogate it. But theory of change can also mean like a larger theory, like Marxism is a theory of change. You can argue that. So for example, like when someone's talking about their theory of change, it could look less like a rationale and more like, you know, a phrase like, through history, transformative changes occurred when exploited workers organized collectively to fight for better working conditions or to wrest power from those who own the means of production. That is a theory of change, not so much a rationale for something I want to do, but a sort of statement about how the world works, how society changes over time, and what we've seen in history. So that's some of the way, excuse me, some of the things that theory of change can mean. And sort of building on that, there are theories of change tools, and I'm going to show you some examples. And actually NGOs, maybe you've come across these, NGOs and different groups use theories of change tools as activities to do together, as processes they sort of move through that help them think about their assumptions and their beliefs about change. And again, with the main goal of systematically interrogating your assumptions. And so that's the tools. So I'm going to show you some examples of tools, But then, as I said, again, there are also grand theories like Marxism, like Gramsci, like Habermas, like others. Intersectional feminism, it has its own theories of change. And your community might have its own theory of change, but this again is not so much an activity you walk through, but a grand system of ideas that provides an explanation about how the world works. It tends to be well developed, backed up with lots of evidence and solid reasoning. And then there's also something that I refer to as theory of change frameworks, which is not as grand as a theory of change and is not as activity-like as a tool, but it's a framework. And I'll show you some examples of those where it like explains the basic structure or like key frame within a grander theory of change. So if I'm losing you, hold on, because I'm going to give you some examples of all these. So I'm going to tell you about some tools first. The most simple theory of change tool, like activity that groups can work through to identify their theories of change, is called the TOC anatomy. And it's these if, then, because statements. So the if is the thing you're going to do, it's the strategy. The then is the goal, the thing you want to accomplish. And the because is where the assumption is interrogated, is made clear. So when you're planning to do something, whether it's about like some bylaw in your community, if we change the bylaw, then blah, 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 because blah, blah, blah. And the because, as I said, is the most important piece. So some examples of a theory of change anatomy kind of thing. If we tell everyone that climate change is real, then we can stop climate change because knowledge leads to action. This is one of the most common assumptions about change. Knowledge leads to action. Is that true? Is it always true? Is it sometimes not true? The minute you name it, you can actually have a conversation. If we just are saying, if we tell everyone climate change is real, then we can stop climate change, the conversation, the debate is quite fuzzy. The minute we name that, because we can actually get down to concrete empirical things that we can actually talk about. So these can get more complex. If we can fundraise enough money to send to frontline communities resisting pipelines, then we can stop the expansion of the tar sands because money is required to sustain long-term resistance. So we're getting more nuanced here, but again, then we could start to ask, does actually long-term resistance require money? Is there other things that are required? Is there some ways that that money can actually cause problems? So you can really pick it apart. So groups go through this. It's the simplest theory of change activity, is just taking what you want to do, what you want to achieve, and why you think it's going to work, and inserting it into this if, then, because statement. A more complex theory of change activity is brought to you by DIY Toolkit. I provide the website here. And this is a sheet you can fill out together with people you're working with on different activist organizing. And it asks you to walk through the answer specific questions and then identify the key assumption of each one. So who's your key audience? That's the second one. And if you look down, it's going to prompt you to say, what are your assumptions underlying why you think that is the key audience, the people you are trying to influence. And at each step of walking through the logic of the thing you're planning, you name your assumptions. So this is something useful too. So these are two examples of tools you can, theory change tools. But as I said, sometimes when we say theory of change, we're not talking about tools, we're actually talking about grand theories. I'm just going to give some examples of those. They can be kind of academic-y, and like, who has the time to sit down and read a giant tome of theory before they take action in the world? Not a lot of us. So, so I'll just point you towards some, but there are like a million more. But like I said, Marxist theories of revolution that focus on parties and class struggle and ideology. That's a grand theory of change. So is Gramsci, who really focuses on the role that culture and hegemonic ideas, the way society is controlled or maintained or changed through what we consider normal, through what cultures value and consider normal, this kind of thing. Habermas really emphasized that things can really change when there are conditions whereby people can really talk to each other in really generative ways. That might resonate with the Long Talks community. And then there's many other theories of change, like mainstream liberal theories that just talk about parliamentary democracy as the means for social change, or people making individual choices that are rational. It's the theory of change. It's not one I agree with, but it is. And like I said, intersectional feminism, Indigenous scholars have a host of really helpful theories of change as well. If anyone is interested in this, feel free to get in touch. I did a huge giant literature review for my PhD on different academic theories of change. And so I can share that for anyone who's interested to think more about that. But more fun than grand theory is frameworks. These I really like because they can spark really interesting ideas around how change happens without having to read a giant book or many books. So I really like Joanna Macy's. Joanna Macy's is does anyone know Joanna Macy? She's an eco-feminist Buddhist systems theorist who does the work that reconnects, which is a really beautiful process to help people process their feelings of grief and anger at this time in history, in this moment, and so those processes can support their action in the world. And she talks about the three dimensions of the Great Turning. She really emphasizes that we need to be doing the resistance, so stopping the destruction and defending what we love, but we also need to be creating and promoting the alternatives. And she says, but those two each are completely necessary on their own, but insufficient in themselves. You also need to be changing underlying value systems and worldviews. So she talks about how much of the debates in our activist circles or communities are around, no, we need to be resisting. No, we need to be creating solutions. No, we need to be focusing on values and worldviews and our understandings and education. And she's arguing each of these are insufficient on their own, but completely necessary. And we need to be finding ways to do all these things and weaving these various dimensions of change together. And then one of my other faves is Ethan Miller's 4 Wings of a Transformative Movement. He also emphasizes that we need to be creating the ways of living, creating new systems, new structures, and defending what we love. But he also offers that we need to be actually working in offense, actually actively dismantling the oppressive institutions and practices. So he builds on Joanna's thing by talking about the need to actively dismantle things. And he also emphasizes the need for healing, of recovering from trauma, staying strong, and building this sort of interpersonal relations that can keep us strong. Another framework I really like is the sustainability tree, or sometimes called the inequality tree. And it's a way of thinking through what you want to do by identifying the symptoms of the problem, which are, you look at as like branches and leaves of a tree, symptoms of a problem. So like for climate change, the symptoms are like rising sea levels, impacts to communities, threats to agricultural systems. But then you identify, okay, well, what are the institutions that are allowing this ongoing problem and these impacts and these symptoms to keep going? So maybe institutions like the banks, the economic systems, the governmental systems, the failed democracy. You start to name the institutions that are undergirding and allowing these symptoms to carry on. But then even deeper, you start to look at the root causes. What are the ideas, the assumptions, the values, the worldviews that allow these institutions to perpetuate? So then you start talking about capitalism, colonialism, hierarchy, relations of oppression. You start to name those things, and this allows groups to actually design their interventions so you're actually targeting not just the symptoms, but the institutions and the root causes. So this is a really cool framework, theory of change framework that's useful. I'm just going to talk a little bit. I'm not going to talk for tons longer. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I've approached theories of change in my own work. And then we'll move over to Q&A and stuff. But so for my PhD, I finished my undergrad and had learned tons and tons and tons about the environmental climate crisis. And my head was full of the problems. I had some idea of some solutions, but I had learned almost nothing about how we get from here to there. I had learned nothing about how transformative change. I learned nothing about theories of transformative change. So I decided to focus on that for my PhD. And to do that, I decided, again, to do this work collectively and thinking together, thinking collectively, theorizing collectively. So I went out and chatted, interviewed many people in the anti-pipeline, Indigenous land defense, and climate justice movements across Canada. And I asked them many questions from What is your end goal? What are the barriers to change? How do you think we could strengthen our movements? But I also asked them, what is your theory of change? How do you think large-scale transformative change can happen or does happen? And so I learned tons. And like my own personal approaches to change are completely now informed almost exclusively by these conversations. I learned so much, and my recent book, More Powerful Together, is based on all these conversations. And so, you know, around 100 people gave me their theory of change, and from that, I assembled it all into one chapter in my book, my thesis, trying to bring all that wealth of insight about how change happens into one sort of as pieces of one larger view, or like as pieces of a puzzle. And this here, this image, this figure, this graphic is how I'm expressing what I heard from everyone. So I heard from folks that system transformation can happen through a convergence of forces, including the context. So where you are in time and space can really determine what's possible. Sometimes crisis can happen, or different events that open up opportunities or make things possible that weren't possible before. So you need to be really aware of the context in which you're acting, and the timing in the moment, and what is politically, what are the opportunities. So they emphasize the context, but they also emphasize how we understand and what we value, much like Joanna Macy emphasized. That really, really matters. They talked a lot about the need for education, both like popular education, community education, changing our actual formal education system. They talked about the need for systemic analysis, really understanding the systems that are perpetuating the crises, and really understanding them enough so that we can transform them, dismantle them, and rebuild them. They talked a lot about that. To really understand the system, we need to be hearing from the folks who are most impacted. And we need to be amplifying the voices of those most impacted. And in Canada, that largely means listening to Indigenous folks about what's wrong and what needs to happen, and following their leadership. So yeah, context is important. How we understand what we value is really important. But of course, it also matters how we take action. So people did emphasize the need to engage in electoral the system, and making sure we have leadership in there that is at least minimizing harm, if not transforming things. But they also made clear that's not enough. We need to be building power through collective action, and actually using that people power that we build through organizing to actually confront and dismantle the systems of power that are in place. But also we need to be innovating and promoting the solutions. So living and promoting the energy systems, the water systems, the infrastructure, the social systems, the electoral systems that we want to see. So yeah, creating the world we want. But interesting, and this was the part that really surprised me, is that woven through almost everyone emphasized that how we relate really, really matters to whether we can bring about transformative change. They talked about the need to coordinate. It's not enough that there are tons of people doing different things all over the place. It actually matters how we coordinate our efforts. Are we pushing against each other? Are we pushing to collectively in a common direction? And they talked about to actually coordinate across different parts of our movements, different communities across the country. We need more relations of solidarity. We need to be building solidarity across movements, across communities, across different struggles. And that to do that well, to build the kind of relations that we need to have a strong force for transformative change, we need to be undoing systems or relations of oppression and domination within our movements, within our communities. The way racism, sexism, colonialism, classism, the way these play out in our movements and our communities are weakening our force for change. So how we relate was woven through all the other dimensions of change that these people brought up. So you can read the whole chapter if you want to hear more about this really complex and nuanced theory of change. And I'm not going to go through all this because I've been talking for a long time, but like I said, I also did a huge literature review on academic theories of change, and I pared them down to key lessons, 8 key lessons for activists from academic theories of change. And these lessons range from to change the system, we need to understand the system and we need to think in system. So it's fun to say that, but actually, what does that mean? Well, I explain that in my thesis and in the book in much more detail. So other key lessons are that power, really understanding power and how power moves through society and through our communities is really important in determining how to change things and why things don't change. And again, yeah, this emphasis, number 8, relationships are at the heart of transformative change. Super important. Another thing, yeah, lesson 2, there are many kinds of change, and it's helpful to know exactly what kind of change you are working to bring about. So, I mean, changing one bylaw is one thing. Changing an economic system is a different thing. Changing your lifestyles and I create a framework of about 8 different kinds of change, and each one has really different implications for what it's going to take. So it's important to think what is exactly the kind of change you're interested in. So yeah, these are some of the stuff that came out of the much reading I did during my PhD around theories of change. And I just want to share that these much of what I learned is in the book, which is available from Fernwood Publishing. But also I wanted to make sure that these findings from my research was available to folks who maybe couldn't afford the book or maybe didn't have time to read the book. So I pared it down to a 30-page executive summary for activists and land defenders, which is available on my website for free in English and in French, which has much of the same stuff from the book, but pared down to its essence. And I also wanted to share, these are some of my favorite books I've read on how change happens that I find really inspiring. I'm happy to share these slides with you later. So if you interested in going see more about this. And yeah, that's it. I'll stop sharing and we can start talking. I just need to find my cursor. Okay.
Thank you, Jen.
You're welcome.
Okay, there we go. Now I can see everyone a bit more clearly. So we will go to Q&A. I'll just see what pops up here. Question from Jen.
I can try and start us off while everybody is percolating. Thank you. I loved listening to that. And I, had like potentially prepared a couple of questions, most of which you have already addressed, because yeah. But I guess one question that I found myself thinking about, which is potentially like a little bit mundane, but is in creating solidarity and creating relations and some of the things we have to sort of like unlearn or address within ourselves. I remember when I was very young and I became a vegetarian, and people had to sort of like reject that because they didn't want to become a vegetarian. And they felt that my deciding to make a personal choice for myself and to engage in that thing, they took sort of offense at that and thought I was saying that that's what everyone should be doing. And so it created a fractured relation. And so part of me feels like that comes from us, that there's like this implicit sense that if people are doing something, that if I choose to do a thing, that's normative, that I think everybody should be doing that thing. And which is all to say that the context part, I think, is extremely important. I don't know that any part is more important than another, but I feel like has grounding in culture and worldview that is like a bigger task than it looks on the surface. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, how do we, when we talk about what we're doing or we engage in action, how do we amplify context so that we can remain in solidarity with people that are doing really different things without our own actions appearing to be sort of like normative judgments about what we think everybody should be doing. And did you find any guidance about what people do to manage that?
That's a great question. Yeah, that is definitely something, because activists by nature are passionate people that are normative. Like activism is normative. It's like taking action based on what you think needs to happen, what you think should happen. You know, it's inherently normative. So, but it also, it can be, yeah, it can come across as righteous and judgy, for sure. I mean, every climate activist who sat at their family, you know, Thanksgiving table knows that everyone finds them annoying. It's just clear. But this is something that I think, if in our communications as activists, we sort of draw on this sort of philosophy that Joanna Macy and Ethan Miller and others are trying to promote, which is that it's going to take many people doing many kinds of things, right? It's not like we need everyone doing exactly the same thing. That's not going to work. There are so many things that need to change, and so many levers that need to be pulled, and so much work that has to be done, that we need a wide diversity. Like in the interviews that I did, people talked about like having like a diverse ecosystem of approaches to change. Many people are doing many different kinds of things, and for that ecosystem for that diversity to be healthy, there needs to be a shared sense that what each of us is doing is important, is necessary, but insufficient on its own. And that, so like, we don't all have to be out on the front lines or out on the street. Not everyone likes that. Some of us can be doing the work of organizing behind the scenes. Some of us can be doing the communication work. Some people could be doing that, growing the food. You know, there's so many things that need to be done. It's when we get wrapped up in thinking our thing is the thing. It's kind of like a reductionist tendency to think that the thing I think is that I love to do, that I am most excited about, is the one and only thing that needs to happen. Then it perpetuates this unpleasant stuff of righteousness that people find rightly annoying, and that also creates endless debates on the most effective thing we should be doing. And I think the most effective thing we could be doing is creating these ways of relating to each other, whereby there's a wide diversity of things that need to happen, and each of these is necessary but insufficient on their own. And identifying that I am important, but I'm not, the thing I'm doing is not sufficient on its own, that cultivates a more open and gratitude. Like, I'm very grateful to people who are doing the things that I'm not doing out there, and I value their work. You know what I mean? And when you can think like that, when you can start to value the diverse approaches to change, the diversity of ways people are approaching these things, those kind of relations that are opened up by being grateful and knowing that you're insufficient but important, creates better opportunities for collaboration and coordination, right? Then do endless debates about what is the one thing we should all be doing. You know what I mean? So yeah, I feel like the Joanna Macy framework, but as well that the theory of change I showed you from my own research, that's really communicated through that, because there are like a million things in there, and none of us can be doing all those things. Not even any organization could be doing all those things. So it implies that different people, different groups, different communities need to be focused on different things, but all these things need to happen if we're gonna successfully push for systemic transformative change. So I think these kind of conversations around diversity, around ecosystem, around many things being necessary but insufficient on their own can create these better relationalities whereby we can work together better. That's a long answer.
I'll give some time. Oh, I have a hand up. Anne, please.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because exactly what you guys were talking about is sort of where my brain keeps going, sort of like interrogating that tension towards my own individual context and the group's context, right? And so I guess if I'm looking at my own skills, values, interests, opportunities as a human, and I'm enmeshed in this broader collective of all of us and then the world beyond, it's just a case of constantly interrogating, like, I get really excited about this, I want to go down this rabbit hole. Is that working in sync with or at opposition to the collective vision and underlying theories of change, and being brave enough to interrogate that on an ongoing basis in my own head, like, you know, oops, I went down this rabbit hole and now I'm actually undercutting the work that our collective is doing together. And that's why it's beneficial to be part of a collective as opposed to a little, you know, isolated human working in isolation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's exactly where we need to go from that last thing we were talking about diverse ecosystem change, many people doing many things, because that sounds great and it is important, but it doesn't mean like that that anything is helpful. Like my ecosystem of transformative change does not include, for example, people who are racist, or the kind of environmentalists who want to defend nature from, who want to remove indigenous people from territories so that the land can be conserved. Like my diversity is not fully inclusive. There, I sort of think of it as a critical holism. Like, so, because we need to be thinking about when that wide diversity of approaches actually starts to undercut. So that I love that you use the word undercutting. When does it actually make someone else's job harder? And that's why I think, yes, we need all that diversity, but we need to align around something to make sure we're all pushing in the same direction. And I think, to me, that we need to align around the end goals that I talked about earlier of the people who are most impacted. So I myself, as a white privileged settler person, know that probably my end goals, or even my understandings of change, or how I understand the problems, are probably constrained by my settler worldview, which I'm trying to slowly unlearn, but it still constrains my thinking. So I then learn from the Indigenous frontline activists and the Indigenous scholars and groups like Indigenous Climate Action and others, their end goals. How are they envisioning solutions to climate change that actually undo all forms of oppression? And I adopt those as my end goal, knowing that my end goals probably are going to be somewhat problematic. So I think we need to create these ecosystems of change that are pushing in one direction. We need to align around the end goals of the people most impacted. And that could be in your communities, that could be on the provincial scale, that could be national scale, that could be on the global scale, whatever that is. But we do need to be thinking about how we align so that we can make sure that diversity is mutually strengthening and not undercutting each other. Thanks for that question. Yeah.
Krista. Oh, you're still muted. Krista.
Okay, what I wanted to say really went off of that, that it's really important in relating and finding a diversity of tactics to understand that that doesn't mean like it can be inclusive of everybody. It has to be, inclusivity has to be safe. So when we relate, and we want our theories of change to relate with other people, we have to make sure that they create like safe spaces for those most impacted. And that I think one of the things I see a lot of times that can be a division between like people with like left-leaning theories of change is that sometimes the more mainstream theories and the more like European-based theories, there tends to be this like, so we can all work together, assimilate into this larger theory of change that the majority of us know. And when we're looking at theories of change that are inclusive of other worldviews and world Indigenous folks, that's where we see that division happen. And I don't think people always understand that that's necessarily what's happening. That, if settler populations are going to have healthy relationships with world Indigenous populations, there needs to be an understanding that relating and, a cohesive diversity of tactics doesn't mean, it means letting go of your ways of thinking, right? And that can include, like, sometimes the backbone of the theory, and instead of bringing all of us into understanding, you know, this theory, see how your theories might allow you to come into other worldviews. Because a lot of times there's this idea of compromise so that we can all work together. And that usually is really unbalanced for the people on the bottom.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, Krista. That's extremely, extremely, extremely important. I want to share that in one of the interviews I did for my PhD. I interviewed this amazing Mi'kmaq warrior named Saugij Ward. I don't know if you heard of him. He lives in British Columbia, and he's really involved with Unistoten Camp and other resistance efforts in British Columbia, but he teaches Indigenous warrior societies. And when I started the interview with him, I was telling him that I've been starting to notice that people have really conflicting theories of change, and it really, you know, fractures our movements. And he was like, yeah. And he was like, you know what's even more interesting than that? And he urged me to think about what actually informs people's differing theories of change. He was saying that in his experience, the people who are most impacted, the people who are most impacted by the current systems, are much more likely to have more radical theories of change, to know that conflict is necessary, that compromise just is just around assimilation and watering things down. And he said you see more likely the people with a more reformist sort of work inside the system. People tend to be the people who are currently still benefiting from the current systems. So he was, I didn't go into that because he was urging me to actually look at to analyze the different theories of change I heard from people socioeconomic or various backgrounds, but I had not kept track of those things. That was not the goal of that research. I was thinking together with people. I was not like studying who they are and what their positions were. But that said, I really took that lesson from him, and, you know, did reflect on that a lot in the book, saying that yeah, it's important to not just interrogate our assumptions about change, but interrogate how our assumptions might be about how change happens might actually be reflecting who we are, how we're positioned in society, how we're currently benefiting our current levels of privilege and this kind of thing. Because he was, yeah, white liberals, exactly. Thank you, Saskia. Because you know, there's folks who are involved in the climate movement. Their end goal is to like reduce emissions, you know, and that reflects the fact that they're not feeling impacted by colonial capitalism, if that's not their goal, you know what I mean? So it's important to reduce emissions, but we need to be doing that as like a near-term step on the way to the end goal of transforming colonial capitalism. And so that's, yeah, so I just wanted to thank you so much for bringing that up. And I wanted to thank again Saugij Ward for that teaching about how our theories of change are not just random, they are situated in our positionalities. Yeah.
Can I respond to that a little? I think it's really easy to realize that white liberals do it, but I think it's important to see that other radical European theories of change tend to do that too.
Agreed. Yeah, and that's why I think like at the heart of everything is like settlers and other privileged folks learning that we may not have the answers, and finding the answers in the struggles of those on the front lines and those most impacted, and aligning around those and figuring out how our efforts can support that, and how our, like, even thinking about this bylaw around, you know, invasive species or whatever. How do you think about that particular campaign as a near-term step on the way to you know, transforming colonial capitalism? If you can think about all your interim steps or your like more incremental approaches, and think about how they fit into the bigger, deeper struggle, and how that serves the people most impacted, I think that could keep our sort of diversity of tactics in line towards the thing we're working towards ultimately. Yeah.
Maybe if there's one more question, and then we take a little break. Or if there's nothing more right now, maybe we fill up our tea, use the washroom, come back in. So it's 11:06 right now. Synchronize, synchronize, and we will come back at, sorry, want to come back at 1:15? Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Jen. And we'll continue in a few minutes.